Hi, my name is Chris Brennan with the astrologyschool.com. The purpose of this video is to talk about the whole sign house system. Alright, so let's get right into it. First, let's define our topic. So, whole sign houses is a method or a form of house division of dividing an astrological chart into 12 sectors or zones or what's called houses. So, the concept of the 12 houses has been in use for about 2,000 years now. We can trace the concept back to the Hellenistic tradition starting somewhere around the 1st century BCE. And when you go that far back, one of the things that you actually notice, or that over the past 20 or 30 years that researchers who went that far back and studied the ancient Greco-Roman astrological traditions, what they discovered is that whole sign houses appears to have been the oldest form of house division, so the oldest approach to dividing up the 12 houses, and it also seems to be the predominant or the most popular form of house division for the first 600 or 700 years of the practice of Western astrology, or at least the system of astrology that uses planets, signs, aspects, and houses. That system seems to have originated around the 1st century BCE, and for about the first 700 years, the system that was used the most frequently in their surviving birth charts and in the surviving astrological manuals is the whole sign house system. So it's important for that reason for let's say, historical purposes, but it also has important conceptual and practical implications for astrologers as well. So the system actually, despite being that popular for the first several centuries of the practice of Western astrology, the system was actually lost during the Middle Ages. And it's only since in the past 20 or 30 years, since the 1980s and 1990s, that whole sign houses has been recovered in the astrological tradition. So that's a little bit of background about the topic, about its history and its recent recovery. Let's talk about actually defining the concept. So whole sign houses is actually the simplest method of house division, or at least it's one of the most straightforward methods, because all you have to do in order to calculate whole sign houses is determine what sign of the zodiac the ascendant is located in. And whatever sign of the zodiac that is, that entire sign becomes the first house in the chart. So, for example, let's say that the ascendant is somewhere in the zodiacal sign of Cancer when a person is born. So in that case, Cancer would become the first house. So from 0 to 30 degrees of Cancer would become the first house in that person's chart. And then what you do in order to calculate the rest of the houses is that they all coincide with the subsequent zodiacal signs in zodiacal order, which is counterclockwise. So if Cancer is rising, Cancer is the first house, then that means the next sign in zodiacal order, which is Leo, becomes the second house. And then the sign after that, which is Virgo, would become the third house. And the sign after that, Libra, would become the fourth house, and so on and so forth. So in the whole sign house system, there's always 12 houses, and they perfectly coincide with each of the 12 signs. So this is actually probably the reason why there are 12 houses to begin with, rather than some other number like 4 or 8 or 36. It's because the 12 houses were originally meant to coincide with the 12 signs of the zodiac using the whole sign house system. So it's pretty straightforward and easy to calculate. Whatever your rising sign is, that becomes the first house. It doesn't matter if the ascendant is really early in the sign or really late in the sign. That rising sign becomes the first house nonetheless. And then the sign after that becomes the second house, and the sign after that becomes the third house, and so on and so forth. So in this approach, the 10th house is always the 10th sign relative to the rising sign. So it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to calculate. You just need to know what sign of the zodiac the ascendant is located in, basically. And then you can calculate whole sign houses in anyone's chart. So the next question that often comes up is, what do you do then about the midheaven? So what about the degree of the midheaven? And in whole sign houses, the degree of the midheaven, or the meridian, actually floats around the top half of the chart, and it can fall in a number of different whole sign houses, and it acts like a sensitive point, kind of like the vertex or the lot of fortune does, the part of fortune in some modern astrological charts, at least in terms of how modern astrologers often treat those points. And what happens is that the degree of the midheaven will import 10th house significations into whatever whole sign house it falls. So if the degree of the midheaven falls in the 9th whole sign house, then it's going to import and it's going to double up on significations from both the 9th house and the 10th house in the 9th sign relative to the rising sign. Or if the degree of the midheaven falls in the 11th sign from the rising sign, so the 11th whole sign house, then it will double up 10th house and 11th house significations in the entirety of that sign. So again, the degree of the midheaven is like a sensitive point that floats around the top half of the chart and imports significations into whatever house it falls. So the degree of the IC does the same thing, except it imports 4th house significations into whatever whole sign house it falls in the bottom half of the chart. So in that way, and this usage is actually outlined already in a 2nd century text by the astrologer Vedius Valens, but in that way, the approach to whole sign houses already represents a sort of hybrid approach between the whole sign approach and the other systems of quadrant house division, just by taking into account the degree of the MC and the degree of the IC and using them as sensitive points. There's also other ways that you could use hybrid approaches in order to incorporate other forms of house division on top of whole sign houses. But the important point is just using whole sign houses as a starting point or as a foundation for determining the basic significations of the houses and then building on that from there. So whole sign houses is actually a pretty useful form of house division, and it's a pretty impressive form of house division once you actually test it out. And one of the recommendations that I usually have for people if they want to test it to see if it works is to apply transits to whole sign houses and to start looking at their chart and the charts of other people that you want to study through the lens of whole sign houses using transits. And the way to do this, the most effective or the most sort of impressive demonstration that you can do, or impressive test, is to look at ingresses of planets into new zodiacal signs. Because one of the things that you realize when you're studying transits through the lens of whole sign houses is that when a planet moves into a new sign of the zodiac, it's also moving into a new house in the whole sign house system, because the cusps of the zodiacal signs are essentially the cusps of the houses in the whole sign approach. So sometimes you can see this with interplanet transits, but it's typically actually most impressive or striking with outer planet transits, like watching Saturn move from one zodiacal sign to another, and then seeing if the topics shift in that person's life of Saturn moving from one whole sign house to another. For example, a shift of Saturn going from the 4th whole sign house and matters having to do with the home and the living situation or the parents perhaps being more prominent, versus Saturn moving into the 5th whole sign house and suddenly other topics related to the 5th house, like the topic of children, becoming more prominent in the person's life. So there's many different sort of combinations or variations you can do in terms of studying Venus ingresses or Jupiter ingresses or Mars ingresses or what have you. But the basic point is just that you can test to see if whole sign houses is working by studying your transits and studying planetary ingresses to see if new topics are coming up as soon as the planets switch signs. And I'm actually pretty confident that if you do that test and if you do it thoroughly enough, you'll actually see that there's something going on there that, that this approach to house division should actually merit more attention on your part. But I'll leave that up to you to test to see what you find. Let's see, other points to make. I think that's about it. So, as I said, one of the things about this approach is that even though it was the most popular form of house division for several hundred years, for nearly a millennia, it was lost during the course of the Middle Ages, and it's only in the 1980s and 1990s that this approach to house division has been rediscovered in the West. And so suddenly Western astrologers are starting to use it again, and it's actually becoming quite popular. So that I've seen 2 polls recently that said that whole sign houses is now the second most used system of house division next to Placidus, with Placidus, of course, being the primary form of house division that most modern astrologers have used over the course of the past century. But it's interesting to see where things are headed, and lots of people are getting excited about whole sign houses and starting to integrate it into their approaches to astrology, either as their only approach to house division or as a secondary approach in addition to other forms like Placidus or Porphyry or equal houses or what have you. So I'd encourage you to check it out, to research it for yourself, and I think you'll like what you find. All right, so that's it for this video on the whole sign house system. If you want to learn more about the history of ancient house division and how the different forms of house division came about, I actually have a chapter on that topic in my recent book, which is titled Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune. I also teach an online course on ancient astrology, which you can find out more information about at theastrologyschool.com. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.